Welcome to this video on the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, 2006. This act serves as a rights-based framework for correcting historical injustice. The Forest Rights Act, 2006, or FRA, is landmark legislation that recognizes the rights of forest-dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers. Enacted in December 2006 and enforced in January 2008, it restores tenure, livelihood, and governance rights over forest lands and resources. Historically, colonial forest acts centralized state control over forests, extinguishing traditional rights and labeling forest-dependent communities as encroachers. Post-independence policies continued this exclusionary structure, leading to large-scale displacement for projects like national parks and mining. The preamble of the FRA recognizes this historical injustice. The Act seeks to restore tenure security, recognize customary governance, decentralize forest governance through Gram Sabha, and protect livelihood and cultural identity. The FRA applies to various forest lands, including reserved forests, protected forests, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, revenue forests, and unsurveyed forest areas. Eligible beneficiaries are forest-dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers. For scheduled tribes, a claimant must belong to a notified tribe, primarily reside in forest land, and depend on it for bona fide livelihood needs. Occupation and dependence must predate December 13, 2005. A constraint is that many genuine tribal claimants lack valid ST certificates. Individual forest rights, or IFR, pertain to rights over forest land for self-cultivation and habitation. Recognition is capped at 4 hectares and limited to actual occupation before December 13, 2005. IFRs are heritable but non-transferable, with joint title for spouses. Eviction is not permitted arbitrarily. Community rights, or CR, include grazing, fishing, rights over water bodies, access to seasonal resources, minor forest produce, and traditional customary uses. These rights recognize the collective relationship between the community and forests, protecting livelihood systems. Community Forest Resource Rights, or CFRR, are a transformative provision. They transfer governance authority to the Gram Sabha to protect, regenerate, conserve, and manage community forest resources. These rights have no explicit area ceiling but are limited to traditional boundaries and established community use patterns. Habitat rights are recognized under Section 3(1)(e) for particularly vulnerable tribal groups, or PVTGs. They cover customary habitat, seasonal resource access, sacred landscapes, mobility routes, and cultural spaces. These rights recognize collective territorial identity, crucial for nomadic and semi-nomadic PVTGs. The FRA recognizes ownership rights over minor forest produce, or MFP, which includes bamboo, tendu leaves, honey, and medicinal plants. This shift enhances livelihoods and tribal economic empowerment. However, issues like monopoly procurement structures and market access barriers persist. The FRA establishes a 3-tier structure for claims disposal. The Gram Sabha initiates the process, followed by the subdivisional level committee, which reviews and consolidates claims. The district level committee has the final authority for approval or rejection. State-level monitoring is handled by the SLMC. This flowchart illustrates the detailed steps for vesting individual rights and the process steps for the recognition of community rights under the FRA. It highlights the involvement of the Gram Sabha, the Forest Rights Committee, and the subdivisional and district-level committees. The FRA places the Gram Sabha at the core, empowering it to initiate and verify claims, protect forests, and manage CFR areas. However, administrative and bureaucratic controls often sideline Gram Sabhas, undermining community autonomy. The FRA's evidence framework is rule-based and flexible, accepting records, satellite imagery, and community testimonies. Yet in practice, multiple supporting documents are often demanded, making the burden of proof technical and inadequately accepting oral evidence. This chart shows forest rights claimed and recognized across the top 10 states with a high tribal population relative to the tribal population and forest cover. Claims received vary widely, as do the recognized rights. Major constraints in FRA implementation include structural issues, such as the documentation burden and ST certificate issues. Administrative resistance and technical constraints, like poor mapping support, also pose challenges. Furthermore, institutional weaknesses, such as inactive forest rights committees, hinder progress. Common grounds for claims rejection include, quote, insufficient evidence, forest offense history, and, quote, encroachment. Critical issues are mass rejections without speaking orders, and the absence of proper appeal mechanisms, leading to continued tenure insecurity and erosion of trust. Section 13 establishes that the FRA has an overriding effect, superseding inconsistent provisions of laws like the Indian Forest Act and the Wildlife Protection Act. Rights recognition is mandatory before forest land diversion, and no eviction is allowed until the verification process is complete. The FRA applies inside protected areas, including national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and tiger reserves. Relocation from critical wildlife habitats is permissible only after a scientific assessment, Gram Sabha consultation, rights recognition, and informed consent. FRA compliance is mandatory for development projects, including mining, linear infrastructure, dams, and industries. The Gram Sabha must certify the completion of rights recognition and the consent process, although procedural bypassing remains a concern. The FRA rules of 2008 provide the operational framework. The 2012 amendments strengthened Gram Sabha authority, community rights, and evidentiary flexibility, while focusing on areas like habitat rights and appeal mechanisms. The FRA has created legal tenure recognition, expanded community governance, and increased livelihood security. However, gaps remain, such as the slow recognition of community forest resource rights, uneven statewide implementation, and weak post-rights support. The FRA holds national significance as a governance framework, linking constitutional justice, ecological conservation, tribal self-governance, and livelihood security. Key policy concerns require immediate attention, including the time-bound disposal of pending claims, correction of wrongful rejections, recognition of habitat rights, and strengthening Gram Sabhas through capacity building. Sustainable forest governance relies on recognizing the rights, knowledge systems, and stewardship role of forest-dwelling tribal communities.